I'm 32. I paid for my stepfather's funeral so my mother wouldn't go broke. She publicly called me greedy instead of saying thank you, all because of $800 I didn't spend the way she wanted. Hi. My name is Sarah. I know, it sounds like some wild soap opera, but this is my life, and all of it crashed down on me in less than a month. I'm 32, and for the past 10 years, I've been constantly balancing on the edge, trying to juggle life as a homeowner, a freelancer, and a person who absolutely does not want to watch her mother, Julia, fall into another financial pit. My mother and Robert, my stepfather, were together for 20 years. Robert had his own small business, which, as it turned out, was running on hope and a credit card. He passed away suddenly. He just collapsed at home in the evening while my mother was watching TV. A heart attack. I arrived an hour later, and that was the first thing I saw, my mother sitting on the floor next to his body, just staring into the void, and all around us, an absolute, stunning mess, as if his life had just burst, scattering into pieces that now needed me to put them back together. I didn't have strong feelings for Robert. He was a decent guy, not my father, but he took care of my mother the best he could. However, he was never particularly forthright. When I started going through the papers, I saw exactly what I feared. Zero savings, a couple of insurance policies that didn't even cover half of what was needed, and a stack of unpaid bills. My mother, of course, was in no state to deal with any of this. She was in shock, in true, deep grief that prevented her from even answering the phone. I had to take on everything. I put my work on hold, cancelled all my projects, because I knew that if I didn't do it, the funeral would either drag on for weeks or place an unbearable financial burden on my mother from which she would never recover. And I knew her credit history perfectly, she couldn't even finance a vacuum cleaner. I quickly assessed the situation. To give Robert a dignified burial, it would cost about $12,000. That's not just money, it's a colossal sum when you're already carrying 2 mortgages for your own house and car. But I couldn't let my mother worry about this too. I borrowed from my brother, Daniel, liquidated the rest of my investment account, and had to dip into the credit card that I'd been saving for emergencies, hoping never to use it. I planned a modest yet respectful funeral. I chose cremation with a subsequent church service. I rented a small, cozy hall for the reception, ordered moderate catering so everyone would have enough, and bought the most beautiful bouquet I could find. Everything was proper, respectful of Robert's memory. For the next week, I rushed between the funeral home, banks, the church, and my mother's house, sleeping 3 hours a night, trying to keep a straight face in front of everyone who called to offer condolences. I did everything so my mother could simply grieve without thinking about logistics or money. And then, after the service, as everyone was starting to leave, my mother pulled me aside. I expected a hug, tears of gratitude, a simple thank you. But she looked at me with a cold stare I had never seen before. She leaned in so no one could hear and told me I had embarrassed her in front of Robert's friends. She said I did everything too modestly, that the hall was small, there wasn't enough food, and that even the bouquet wasn't the most expensive. I stood there, and the only thing I could think about was the $12,000 I had pulled literally out of the ground, and my credit limit, which I had just completely maxed out. Then she added, Robert deserved a proper send-off, Sarah, it's only $800 that you skimped on a proper casket, and instead you chose to take him to a crematorium. At that moment, I felt something inside me just break. It wasn't $800, it was the rest of my money, and it was my choice to keep her from going bankrupt, yet all she saw in it was my greed. That was only the first day of hell. My mother started using Robert's death to punish me, turning every condolence call into a public shaming about the shabby funeral I paid for with borrowed money. The week after Robert's funeral was supposed to be a period of calm, a space for my mother, Julia, to process her grief, and for me to finally get back to the pile of freelance work that was threatening to bury my career. Instead, it became a continuous, low-level siege against me. My mother's grieving process wasn't quiet, it was loud and aimed directly at my choices. She didn't yell, which would have been easier to handle. She used a specific kind of quiet, venomous disappointment that was far more effective. Every relative, every friend who called to check on her, became an audience for her veiled complaints. I'd overhear her on the phone in the living room, her voice heavy with performative sadness, saying things like, "Oh, thank you, Mary. Yes, it was fine. It was a very simple affair, you know. Sarah had to handle the finances, and she's always been so practical." The subtext was a siren blaring, "I am poor and my daughter is cheap." I still had to stay at her house for a few days to sort out the last of Robert's paperwork and help her transition. It felt like walking on glass. My brother, Daniel, who lives 2 states away, called me every evening. He was the one who loaned me a significant portion of the money, and he knew my financial strain. He tried to mediate, urging me to ignore her dramatics, but he wasn't here. He wasn't seeing her eyes flick to mine whenever she mentioned the word budget. The $800 she mentioned, the difference between the basic cremation package I chose and the open casket viewing she somehow thought we could afford, became her focal point. It wasn't about the money itself, it was about the principle of the spectacle. Robert was a man who valued appearance, and she was convinced that by choosing a simple, dignified farewell, I had somehow diminished his legacy and, more importantly, her status among their social circle. The house was already suffocating with grief and paperwork, and her passive-aggressive attacks were making it toxic. One afternoon, I was struggling to decipher Robert's handwritten notes about his business accounts, trying to figure out if there was any lingering asset we could claim. My mother came into the dining room, holding a framed photo of Robert from 10 years ago, when he was in better shape. She didn't look at the photo. She looked at me. "Robert always dreamed of having a mahogany casket," she sighed, placing the photo down exactly on top of the pile of bank statements I was organizing. "He told me once that anything less was an insult to a man who worked as hard as he did." "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "Robert didn't leave a will, and he left zero savings. He actually left a significant amount of credit card debt. I just paid $12,000, the money I borrowed, to cover the essential costs. There was no money for mahogany, or anything remotely extravagant. I took out a loan just to keep you afloat." She waved her hand dismissively, an infuriating gesture I remembered from my childhood. "Nonsense, Sarah. Robert always had things under control. You just panicked and made the quickest, cheapest decision. You always jump to the worst conclusion. If you had just waited one more week, I'm sure we could have figured out a way to get the proper funeral he deserved. His friends would have helped." That last line hit me hard. His friends would have helped. She was implying that I stole the opportunity for a grand farewell that others would have funded, simply because I moved fast to protect her from financial ruin. She didn't see me as her daughter making a sacrifice, she saw me as a panicked accountant who cut corners. The real tension wasn't just the money, but the debt I was now holding. The 2 existing loans for my house and car were manageable, but that new credit card debt was brutal. The interest rate was high, and I needed to pay it down fast. I hadn't told her or Daniel the exact details of the high-interest debt, only the total cost of the funeral. I kept that specific, terrifying detail, the true extent of the risk I had taken, to myself. I felt intensely alone in this. The following morning, the real conflict began to simmer. I was finally packing up my things to leave. I'd found a small, locked metal box hidden in Robert's desk drawer that hadn't been there before. When I picked it up, it rattled slightly. I showed it to Julia. Her eyes widened for a split second, a reaction too quick for mere grief. "Oh, that old thing," she said, trying to sound casual. "It's nothing. Just some old work trinkets. Throw it out, Sarah. I don't want any reminders right now." But the way she grabbed it from my hand, tucking it immediately under a pile of blankets in the linen closet, told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't nothing. Robert hadn't left me $12,000 of debt just for me to throw out the one thing that might explain why he did it. The box was small, maybe big enough for a thick stack of cash, or a critical document, or something much worse. I left that day, but the image of that locked box was all I could think about. What was in it? And why was my mother lying about it? The clock was ticking on my debts, and I needed to know if I had just paid a massive financial price for something that wasn't over yet. The situation exploded when she found my credit card bill. She didn't pity my debt, she just calculated how much more she could have spent if I hadn't been so financially restricted. After I left my mother's house, I thought the tension would dissipate, but it actually intensified. The distance simply gave my mother, Julia, more space to escalate her performance of the wronged widow. She wasn't just subtly complaining to friends anymore, she started calling my brother, Daniel, directly, weeping about my lack of filial generosity. Daniel called me, clearly stressed. She told me you picked the cheapest flowers, Sarah. She says you should have waited for the life insurance payout, instead of rushing to cremate him. I had to remind him, again, that the life insurance was barely $5,000, most of which was immediately swallowed by Robert's existing, high-interest business debts, and that if I had waited, the funeral home would have charged storage fees that would have doubled the cost. I am drowning in debt right now, Dan. I maxed out a high APR card to make this happen, I told him, finally letting some of the true desperation surface. The emotional manipulation was unbearable, but the real threat remained the small, metal box my mother had snatched away and hidden. I knew she was hiding something important, and my immediate financial crisis made me obsessed with what might be inside. If Robert had any hidden asset, any small life insurance policy I missed, I desperately needed it to cover the brutal payments on my new debt. I was looking at 2 months of barely eating to service the minimum payment, just to avoid spiraling into true bankruptcy. The fact that my sacrifice was met with disdain felt like salt in a gaping wound. The final, definitive break happened 2 weeks after the funeral, the day my credit card statement arrived at my own apartment. I had completely forgotten that, in the rush, I had used my mother's address as the temporary billing address for the new funeral-related purchases, simply because I was staying there at the time and wanted to intercept any important mail. Julia, always nosy and claiming she was just organizing, opened it. She didn't call me. She drove over to my place unannounced. She burst into my apartment, not weeping or sad, but radiating a cold, focused fury. She slapped the opened envelope down onto my kitchen counter. The total balance was staring me in the face, $12,000 charged at 28.99% APR. She had seen the interest rate and the total, and her reaction wasn't empathy. It was pure, selfish resentment. "So you do have money, Sarah," she hissed, her voice low and shaking, much more terrifying than yelling. "You just chose to keep your credit score intact instead of giving your stepfather a proper send-off." I was stunned. "What are you talking about, Mom? That's the debt I took on for you. That's the entire cost of the funeral. I put it on the only high-limit card I had because I needed to pay the funeral home immediately so we could bury him. And the interest rate is astronomical." She looked at the total number, then back at me. "If you had $12,000 credit available, you could have easily spent $2,000 or $3,000 more. You could have gotten the real casket. You could have paid for the better haul. But you didn't. You saw the high interest rate and got scared of having to pay it off, so you deliberately chose the cheapest option possible. You prioritized the bank over Robert's dignity. You told me you were broke. You have access to $12,000. It's not access to money, Mom, it's debt. I already have 2 existing loans for my house and car. This third debt is crushing me. I did the math, I spent what I could without driving us both into ruin. I paid for the funeral so you wouldn't have to carry this. And you're accusing me of being greedy because I didn't spend the money I don't actually have?" Her response was chilling. She leaned in, her eyes dead cold, echoing the first confrontation at the wake, but this time, fueled by the hard numbers on the statement. "No, I'm accusing you of being skimping. You paid $12,000, but you could have pushed it to $15,000. You had the limit. You were just too financially restricted by your own fear to do the right thing for Robert." The injustice of her words, seeing the full truth of my precarious financial life twisted into evidence of my selfishness, was a gut punch. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a grieving mother, I was dealing with a woman who had fully internalized Robert's focus on external appearance and would never forgive me for not delivering the spectacle she felt entitled to. She didn't care about the numbers, only the lack of show. The tension was now a tangible thing, a wall between us. I had to pay my debts, and I was convinced the key to solving the financial mess, and potentially exposing my mother's true motives, was still sitting in her linen closet. I knew I couldn't just ask for the box back. I had to find a way to get it myself. I broke into my mother's linen closet while she was out. I found the metal box and saw the real reason Robert died suddenly and why my mother called me cheap. It wasn't about the $800, it was about $100,000 I didn't know existed. The confrontation over the credit card bill severed the last functional tie between me and Julia. After she left my apartment, spewing venom about my financial restrictions, I knew any hope of a normal, healthy relationship with my mother was gone, at least for now. I spent the next week barely functioning, trying to juggle my suddenly urgent freelance workload while the interest clock on the $12,000 ticked louder than any timepiece. The only thing I could focus on was that small, locked metal box hidden in her linen closet. I couldn't shake the feeling that my mother's cold fury wasn't solely about the modest funeral, it felt too intense, too calculated. Her rage felt like a cover for something much more significant than a slight to Robert's memory. I needed to know what was in that box, not just for financial clarity, but for my own sanity. If it contained documents proving Robert was deep in a shady deal, it might explain the sudden collapse and the lack of savings. If it contained money, it would prove my mother was lying and had deliberately forced me into debt. The risk of breaking into her house and stealing the box was huge. She would never forgive me, and Daniel would be furious if he ever found out. But the moral dilemma of maintaining my integrity versus securing the potential truth, and a lifeline for my debt, was no contest. My own financial stability was collapsing under the weight of her demands. I waited for the perfect opportunity, which came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after Robert's death. Julia had a regular bridge club meeting she never missed. I drove over to her house, taking a deep, cold breath before using the spare key I still kept. The moment I stepped inside, the silence felt heavy, accusatory. I moved quickly, heading straight for the linen closet. The box was exactly where she'd hidden it, tucked beneath a stack of old towels and a winter blanket. It was heavier than I expected. I tried to pick the lock, but it was sturdy. I finally found an old screwdriver and, with trembling hands, managed to pry the latch open just enough to bend the metal. It took about 5 minutes of scraping, loud enough that I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced she would walk in. When it finally gave way, the sound was a sharp, metallic clink that echoed in the quiet house. I pulled the lid open. My breath hitched. It wasn't a will, or an insurance policy, or a stack of cash. It was a single, folded trust agreement and a thick, official-looking document from a small bank I didn't recognize. The trust agreement was dated 3 years ago. I unfolded the trust agreement first. Robert had quietly set up an irrevocable trust for Julia. The document stated that upon his death, the remaining assets, minus any secured debts, were immediately transferred into the trust for her long-term care. The kicker was on the bank document. It confirmed the transfer of $100,000, from a previously undisclosed business savings account into the trust, executed 2 days after his death. Robert had kept a secret, substantial savings account, and set up a mechanism to protect it specifically from creditors and, apparently, from me. I stood there, leaning against the closet door, feeling physically sick. My mother wasn't broke. She had access to $100,000, securely protected. She had known about this trust, or at least the existence of a large sum of money, when she watched me max out my credit card. The money was untouchable by me, by the funeral home, or by Robert's minor creditors, but it was absolutely there to pay for a dignified funeral. She hadn't been grieving over finances, she had been grieving over the inconvenience of having to dip into her secret nest egg, even a small fraction of it. And she had used my willingness to help, my 2 existing loans and my new, crippling high-interest debt, as a shield. The twist wasn't just that she had money. The twist was the brutal calculation behind her anger. The $800 she complained about wasn't a cost I spared, it was the amount she felt she should have been reimbursed from my debt, essentially paying me back for the funeral, and then having extra money left over for the elaborate casket without touching her $100,000. She wanted the spectacle, she wanted the $100,000 untouched, and she wanted me to remain stuck with the high-interest debt as proof of my selfishness. I quickly put the box back and closed the closet door, barely securing the bent latch. I left the house with the documents folded tightly in my pocket. I knew I couldn't confront her directly yet, she would deny everything and destroy the evidence. The moral dilemma was blinding, I now had proof she forced me into debt while holding a safety net. Should I expose her to Daniel, risking a complete, irreversible family war, or should I use this leverage to demand repayment of my debt, turning our relationship into a purely transactional one? The game had just changed entirely. I didn't expose her secret to the family. Instead, I gave her an ultimatum with the evidence in my hand. Her reaction wasn't shame, but a brutal confirmation that some mothers value their peace of mind more than their children's financial survival. The 24 hours after I found the trust agreement felt like a pressurized vacuum. I was vibrating with a cold fury that made the preceding weeks of tension feel like a slight tremor. The documents confirming my mother, Julia, was sitting on $100,000 while watching me take on crippling debt were tucked safely inside my fireproof safe. The true cost of the funeral wasn't the $12,000 I paid, it was the realization that my mother's love and gratitude had a price tag, and that price was less than the interest rate on my maxed-out card. I decided against telling Daniel. Exposing her financial deception to the family would instantly detonate everything. Daniel would demand she repay me, she would deny the documents were real, and the family would split. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for financial survival and the acknowledgement that my sacrifice was not only real but deliberately exploited. My approach had to be surgical. The next evening, I drove back to her house. I didn't call ahead. I walked in and found her in the kitchen, meticulously cleaning Robert's old favorite coffee mug, a piece of performative grieving I could now see right through. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, which seemed to unnerve her more than yelling would have. "I'm busy, Sarah," she replied, not looking up, "and I'm still extremely upset about that credit card statement you left lying around." I interrupted her, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I need you to reimburse me the full amount of the funeral costs, $12,000. Immediately. I expect the funds to be transferred within 48 hours. She finally looked up, her face a mask of patronizing disbelief. "Are you serious? You've lost your mind. I just told you I have no savings, Sarah. I'm a widow living on a small pension now. I barely have enough to cover property taxes. Do you honestly think I would have let you pay for it if I had that kind of money?" I didn't answer with words. I pulled the two key documents, the trust agreement and the bank confirmation showing the $100,000 transfer, out of the envelope I was holding and slid them across the granite counter until they stopped right in front of her. She didn't need to read them. Her eyes, which had been full of righteous indignation a second ago, went completely dead. The color drained from her face, leaving her cheekbones stark white. For a moment, she was utterly silent, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. It was the moment of absolute, crushing exposure. "You went through my things," she whispered, her voice cracking, but the emotion wasn't shame, it was pure violation. "I found the box where you hid the evidence that you lied to me, lied to Daniel, and watched me take on ruinous high-interest debt just so you wouldn't have to touch your hidden nest egg," I corrected her, keeping my voice low and steady. "It wasn't about Robert's dignity. It was about your personal convenience and your perception that $100,000 intact looks better than $88,000. You used my two existing loans as proof that I was the financially irresponsible one, the cheap daughter, while this safety net was sitting right under your nose." She finally found her voice, not in apology, but in justification. "That money is for my future, Sarah. For when I'm old, for medical bills, for a place to live." You have your whole life ahead of you, you can earn it back. I can't. Robert worked his whole life to give me this security. If I spent even $12,000 of it now, I would panic. It would be gone, and then what? You're young, you can afford to carry debt for a while. This is a matter of my peace of mind. That was the ultimate confirmation. My crippling financial anxiety was merely a temporary inconvenience to her, easily justified by her need for peace of mind. The financial burden I was carrying was a fair price for her psychological comfort. I'm not asking you to spend your future, I replied, grabbing the documents back. I'm asking you to right a deliberate wrong. You have 48 hours to transfer the $12,000. If you don't, I will send copies of these documents to Daniel, and I will let him draw his own conclusions about why I had to pay for Robert's funeral out of my own high-interest debt, despite his financial preparations for you. I left. I didn't wait for her response. 42 hours later, a notification popped up on my phone, a deposit of $12,000 hit my checking account. She paid. She chose the money over the war, proving that the $100,000 was more important to her than the relationship with her son. I used the money to immediately wipe out the high-interest credit card debt. I was technically back to where I started, with my 2 original loans, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. I never mentioned the trust to Daniel. My mother never called me again after that day, and I didn't call her. The silence was absolute. The story isn't about the $12,000, it's about the devastating clarity that came with it. I realized some people will always choose their own comfort, security, and perception of dignity over the immediate well-being of the people they claim to love. My mother had her peace of mind, protected by $100,000. I had my financial independence back, but I lost the illusion of a family. Sometimes, the most expensive things we pay for are not with cash, but with the painful, final knowledge of who our loved ones truly are. And that's a debt you can never truly pay off.